In this video, we're going to look at how I do track scenery. This is our starting point, and this is where we're going. I'm certainly not the best scenery person out there, but a lot of the best scenery people aren't making videos, so this is what you get. Hopefully it'll be helpful, but I'm sure it's not the most exciting video you're ever going to see. Some of the main topics we're going to cover are how I paint my rails, how I put down ballast, and how I put the scenery around the track. We're going to see some use of static grass and also a gravel parking lot. These techniques will be the same whether you're using plywood as a sub-road bed or foam or really any other material, and it should be pretty much the same for any scale. I don't consider the end point here to be actually finished. I don't think scenery is ever really finished. There's always more that you can do, but this is where we're going to go in this video. Before you get started, you want to make sure that you have all of your track laid and working, all of your feeder wires are installed, and any missing ties have been replaced under joints. It'll be very difficult to fix these items after we have put the scenery in. I'm using cork road bed from Midwest Products, but you can use any road bed you want. The first step in our scenery is to put Sculptamold around the track area. If you're not using any sub-road bed, you may want to skip that step, but then again, you may not. In preparation for the Sculptamold, we want to put tape over the track, and we want to really cover the track and the ties, and we want to seal it pretty tightly so that we're not going to get any Sculptamold up in between the ties. It's a little bit more difficult to do than you might think, and you'll see what happens once that happens. It's not really that big of a deal, but you want to take the time to put the tape in thoroughly beforehand. Once you've done a really good job of taping over your track and your ties, you're going to want to apply the Sculptamold. So I think this is kind of unusual. I don't know how many people actually do this. So you may want to skip this step. You'll have to see how it looks and whether it's something you want to do. But I really like the appearance that you get from this, especially in areas where you have two tracks running very close to each other. So one thing I'm really trying to do is cover up the look of the cork road bed. So when you're done, you really kind of want it to look like there is no cork or you can't see any cork underneath it. Remember that the Sculptamold is going to make the ground uneven, so if there's a place where you're going to put a building, you probably don't want to put Sculptamold there because otherwise the building won't sit flush, or it'll be difficult to get it to sit flush onto the plywood. In a situation where you have two tracks running close together, the Sculptamold is kind of convenient because it reduces the amount of ballast that it takes to fill in between the two tracks. So in that situation, it's something you might want to think about even if you're not going to put it all the other places. Now we're going to remove the tape, and really it's best not to wait for the Sculptamold to dry thoroughly. You can remove the tape right after you've applied the Sculptamold. There's a couple reasons you want to remove the tape while the Sculptamold is wet. One is that if it dries, it will hold the tape in place and it might be a little more difficult to get the tape off. The second is that the Sculptamold is going to get in amongst the ties. It's something we're trying to avoid by doing a really good taping job, but even though I know to avoid this, and I've done this in the past, I still am never really able to fully tape down the ties such that Sculptamold does not get in there. Now, it's not at all difficult to remove the Sculptamold from in between the ties. It's just tedious, and so it's something you want to avoid for that reason. Here's what it looks like when you have the Sculptamold in between the ties, and I find that the easiest way to remove it is using the end of a file. It seems to be the perfect size to fit in between the ties on HO track. You could also just use a wooden stick. Another tool that you'll want is a knife, and then once you have removed the Sculptamold from in between the ties, just kind of run it down along the surface of the cork along the edge and remove any excess Sculptamold. And now we want to paint the rails, and I like to use this brown camouflage spray paint to paint the rails. And I use either a piece of cardboard or an old piece of foam or something to protect against back spray from the spray can. And then I just want to make sure I cover the ties and both sides of the rails. And since I'm in a kind of a confined space, I do this with a respirator, and it's definitely worth wearing a respirator for this because the fumes for this amount of spraying is pretty obnoxious. You definitely want to make sure that you cover up any white areas that are around the track or in between the ties. While the paint is still wet, I like to take little pieces of green foam left over from doing scenery, and I rub it along the track and remove any of the wet paint to expose the surface of the rails. Even if the paint dries onto the rails, it's really easy to remove. This paint doesn't really stick to the rails very well, but it's just a lot easier to just wipe it right off using a piece of foam. It's also a good idea at this time to make sure the paint does not impede the working of any of your switch points. Now we want to put down a base coat of paint to cover up any of the remaining Sculptamold and also cover up any of the plywood. I like to go to Lowe's or any other paint supply store and get a quart of house latex paint, and I always get matte finish. You want matte finish, and get it in a color suitable for underneath any of the ground cover for the region that you're modeling. So I usually get a can of brown and then a can of green of some shade. And now we're just going to paint over this using disposable brushes, and like I said, you want to cover up any of the Sculptamold. If you didn't use sub roadbed, or if you just didn't want to put down the Sculptamold, you still want to do this step because you want to apply a base paint color underneath the ground cover. Now I like to use green and brown because I can use the green to sort of indicate where I'm going to put grass, and the brown is going to indicate where I'm going to put gravel, or maybe I just haven't decided. Now we want to get ready to apply the ground cover, and first thing we want to do is tape off the track. Now we don't have to do as good of a job as we did with the Sculptamold. We just want to cover up the rails and keep scenery from getting in between the rails and kind of in the ties. Whereas for the Sculptamold, we kind of had to use 2 pieces of tape for each section of track, and here 1 width of tape is generally good enough to get enough coverage. And now we want to apply the glue, and in this case I'm using matte Mod Podge, and I kind of like it because you can get it pretty easily in bulk quantities. In this case I've diluted it about 30% water, 70% matte Mod Podge. Sometimes I use it full strength, and then I just brush it on with a disposable brush. And in this case it looks like I'm getting ready to put on the grass, and so I'm just doing it in the green areas where I'm going to apply grass. I've taped off a little section there under the glue where I'm going to put a building, so I don't want to put any grass where the building is going to go. Now I'm applying the grass. You can use whatever grass you like to use or whatever method to apply it that you like. I usually just start out with a spoon, and then I also use Parmesan shakers to spread ground cover, because you can get very good placement that way. You can get Parmesan shakers from Amazon or any restaurant supply store if you don't like shopping at giant online behemoths. Also, typically I use about 2 different varieties of grass in an area like this. So I have sort of a main grass, and then I'll add some other manufacturer's grass in just as a little bit of accent color in different areas. We're going to apply static grass after this, so you don't necessarily have to do that if you don't want to. Just in general, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this, so feel free to mix up the techniques as much as you want. The next thing I like to do is mist everything with wet water, which is of course water with a little bit of dish detergent in it. I know some people like to use isopropyl alcohol, but I'm always afraid of doing that because it takes off acrylic paint. So if I hit a building or something, it will damage the paint on the building. Once I've wetted it down with wet water, then I come back with some scenic cement. Or you could use white glue or Mod Podge diluted with water, maybe about 70% water and 30% of the glue, and then add like a drop of dish detergent in there to break up the surface tension. So you're kind of making your own scenic cement. But scenic cement from Woodland Scenics has something in it that I've never quite been able to duplicate what their recipe is. So I use it in a lot of cases, even though it's actually really expensive, and you should be able to substitute it with diluted white glue or diluted Mod Podge. Now with everything still wet, I like to come back and apply the static grass if I'm going to use static grass in the particular area that I'm doing. And here I have some Woodland Scenics earth texture in a Parmesan shaker, and I'm applying it near the track area and just adding a little bit of extra color and texture throughout the different areas. This area is going to be a gravel parking lot, so again I start with the diluted Mod Podge and paint that on, and now I'm applying Woodland Scenics gravel. You can use whatever kind of gravel ground cover you want to use. Some people have used Quickcrete, kind of sifted out. I've used that in the past and that works pretty well. So anyway, just sprinkling on the ground cover here with the Parmesan shaker. There is a building in this area, and I've taped over the area where the building is going to go so I don't put ground cover where the building is going to go. The raw gravel is a little too consistent in color for my taste, so I like to put some brown paint in there and then spray it down with some water to kind of make some stains, and we'll do some other things to kind of mix up the color of the gravel. And to really seal it in, I can use the paintbrush to drizzle on some more diluted Mod Podge. Here we're just repeating that same process in another area, and here I'm going to have a road that goes across the tracks. You can see the Wilford J. Bramble kit there on the layout. That was built in a previous video. In this little narrow section between the two tracks, I am going to apply some Woodland Scenics earth texture. Once again, I spray everything down with wet water, and I apply more Mod Podge diluted as necessary and any kind of coloring I want to add. I think it really helps to go find some good spray bottles that have a really nice fine mist, the kind that you would use for plants. Some of the cheaper spray bottles, like plastic ones that you just pick up near the checkout aisle at some place like Lowe's, may not spray very evenly. So I think the quality of the spray really helps. Once you're satisfied with your ground cover, you can remove the tape protecting the track. The next step is going to be to apply the ballast. Now it's time to apply the ballast, and I'm using Woodland Scenics Fine Ballast. I think fine is better for HO scale, and you probably want to go as small as you possibly can. And I find it really easy and helpful to use a ballast spreader. You just fill up the container and run it along the track. One of the reasons that I like to use the Sculptamold is it seems to reduce the amount of ballast that you need to make the track look good. And ballast is much more expensive than Sculptamold, so I think it's worth the extra time to put down the Sculptamold and save on the ballast. After the ballast spreader, I find that the easiest way to get rid of the extra ballast on the ties is just to use my fingers. But I also have this really stiff bristled brush, which is very useful for this to get the ballast away from the tie spikes and the rails. I don't remember where I got it. I wish I did. But you really do want to be careful to make sure that the ballast does not come up above the height of the ties, especially near the rails. It doesn't really cause a problem, but you will hear kind of a crunching sound as some of your locomotive wheels grind against the ballast. So it does increase the noise. Once you've glued the ballast in place, about the only way you can adjust that is grinding it off with a Dremel tool. And of course, the next step is to spray down the ballast with wet water. Now I apply the glue to the ballast, and I just use Elmer's white glue in a glue bottle, and I have it diluted about 50% with water and then add in a drop of dish detergent to break up the surface tension. So I just keep this one bottle that is always diluted and refill it as necessary. And then I just squirt it in between the ties and along the edges. And you just want to be kind of careful that you make sure that the current from the water doesn't go and just take your ballast all off to the side and kind of make a mess. It may look like I'm using a ridiculous amount of glue, but I find that even this amount of glue doesn't fully glue down all of the ballast. So typically I'm going to have to come back and spray it with a little bit of scenic cement. Again, because scenic cement is so expensive, I try to avoid using it whenever possible. I always like to use just diluted white glue or diluted Mod Podge or something similar whenever I can. The next thing I need to do is put down some gravel around the area of the building. So I have some pictures of gravel near railroad areas, so let's take a look. In this picture we can see a variety of gravel sizes. There are some dark puddles along the tracks, and also we can see a transition area from gravel to the grassy area where the railroad ties are being stored. This is actually the same area looking in a different direction. And here the gravel looks much more gray, but that's a little bit of an optical trick because the light temperature is different. So the same gravel can look brown under some light and gray under other light. So how brown or gray you paint it is really up to you. But also note that there's a lot of brown stains and mixes of different gravel sizes. And there's even some old pavement and of course the stacks of railroad ties. Here's another area where the track is practically buried in the gravel. You can see a mix of gravel sizes and some puddles and some black stains around the track farther down. This location is in Fostoria, Ohio, and I think we're looking west in front of the old B&O station. Here, the gravel area is kind of brown with a lot of debris in it and some mixed gravel sizes and some significant color variation. And I think the stack of pallets is a nice detail, as well as the old shipping containers. While the ballast dries, I want to come back to the gravel area, and I use this lightweight spackling compound and kind of smear it around in the gravel to make it look like areas where it's more dirt than gravel. This is something that you commonly see in a lot of old parking lots where the gravel has been there for a while and is not really maintained. If you're doing this on a road, you'll want to do this where the tire tracks from the cars would have compacted down the gravel. Here is my road area, and the spackling compound has dried, and I'm coming back in and I'm painting it using this Vallejo Splash Mud color. You really can just use any colors you want. This is just me kind of playing around with the product, seeing how it works. I'm going to use some Blair line wood crossings here, and so you'll note that I did not put ballast in the areas where I'm going to put the crossings. Now I'm applying some washes of a couple different sand colors from some cheap craft store paints. For me, painting scenery like this is kind of hit or miss. Sometimes you get the look you want right away, and sometimes you have to keep fiddling with it. This one was actually a bit of a struggle, probably because I was filming it. But I just wasn't quite getting the look I wanted. In my opinion, it looks even worse in the video than it does in real life. One of the tricks here is don't really worry about making mistakes. That's kind of how you learn your technique. And for painting stuff like this, it's really easy to come back and do it all over again. Now let's come back to the ballast and deal with this turnout. Of course, you can't use the ballast spreader on a turnout. I like to use the Parmesan shakers, and that gives me really good control for just the right amount of ballast. Of course, it's always better to use too little than too much, because you can always come back and add more, and in fact, you should plan on ballast taking several coats before it really looks good. And then you just want to make sure that your ballast does not get into the frogs permanently. If it does, it's not that big of a deal to remove it. And you want to make sure that your ballast does not interfere with the points operating properly, which is a bigger problem if that happens, a little more difficult to correct. So like I said, just take your time and don't try to get the whole thing done in just one pass. And of course, after spraying it down with some wet water, we glue it in place with the diluted white glue. I wanted to include this clip because I did it at the same time and it's the same area of the layout. Here I have a section between the bridge abutment and the other area of the hill, and I need to cover up that area with some kind of foliage. So I'm using this Woodland Scenics product. It's called Foliage. It's just called Foliage. And I am dipping it in a container here of diluted Mod Podge, about 50% Mod Podge, 50% water. And first I just paint some onto the wall where I'm going to cover it. And then I dip the foliage into the diluted Mod Podge and I apply it. And sometimes you have to come back and do a kind of a second layer, but that's generally what I do. You can come back and add some scenery on top of that, but it's a really good way to cover up areas between bridge abutments or retaining walls and the rest of your scenery. And it actually looks pretty realistic. I watch some cab ride videos, especially of Japan, and they have a lot of hillsides that are covered with this kind of foliage. I think I've also seen it in the South, Alabama, West Virginia, this kind of thing where you have a steep hillside and it is just completely covered with bushes or whatever kind of nondescript foliage. So it's something I like to use a lot, and so I would throw it into this clip. Here we are where the dirt road is crossing the tracks, and I've put down my crossings from Blair Line. Now I want to mask off the wood for the crossings. To bring the road up to the height of the wood for the crossings, I'm going to use this AK Interactive concrete texture. This particular can has almost dried out, so it's really thick and kind of hard to work with. But I'm able to just dig out a chunk and smear it on using artist spatulas. This is an acrylic product, so it thins out with water and you can smooth it out with water. The stuff is fairly expensive. If you're going to buy this on eBay, you're probably going to pay about $20 all in, including shipping. So I use it pretty sparingly, but this situation is really something that it's well suited for. Since this one's pretty dried out, sometimes I have to spray it down with some water to smooth it out. I should mention you can probably use any kind of texture product here because we're going to paint over it, so the color doesn't really matter. AK Interactive seems to make a lot of different texture colors that seem to differ only by the color, and nothing about the texture seems to be any different. And before it dries, I want to remove the blue tape just in case I need to wipe any off of the wood. But it looks pretty good. It's a nice way to bring the road up to the height of the wood crossings. And just needs paint at this point. Now we're ready for the last step on the ballast. So typically this is pretty common. You have areas along the side of the cork where the ballast did not stick. It didn't get glued down, and even though we used Sculptamold, it still kind of left this exposed side. So now what I like to do is just run a bead of white glue along the side of the cork area where the ballast is missing and spread it around, and then just sprinkle some ballast just over that area. And then I'm going to wet it down with some scenic cement. So here I'm doing it in another section of track. I already applied the white glue and I'm sprinkling on the ballast. And then I'm going to spray it with some wet water and then a little bit of scenic cement to seal it in there. And that is pretty much it. Of course, scenery is never really finished. There's always more that you can do. Come back and add some more details. I'd like to add some fencing and maybe some other little accessories, and there are some buildings that are going to go in here. But that is most of what I do to put the scenery around track, including the ballast, grass, and then coloring the gravel. Overall, I was pretty happy with the result. The gravel wasn't quite as good as I would have liked, but it's not that bad, and I can always kind of come back and touch it up later when I'm feeling like it. So I hope you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Thanks for watching.